I can go ahead and kick us all off. That's okay, or is that all right? Okay, good. I'm Julie Watts. I'm Deputy Director for Government Affairs for DCYF. And we're having this meeting because we wanted to provide an opportunity for folks who were kind of hearing about the agency request legislation that the department has been working on to have like a follow-up conversation. Because I think there were folks who were like, what's going on here? Why are they asking us about this? And what would these bills do? And so wanted to have an opportunity just to do a little bit of follow-up, have folks have more time to ask questions, and to talk about this proposal for agency request legislation. And we are fortunate to have Jenny Hedden with us, who is the department's Chief Programming Officer. And she's going to walk through some slides just to give folks a little bit more understanding of how the account currently works. She's also, fortunately, she has some history on the account because she actually wrote the original bill, created the account when she was in staff with the legislature. So she has a little bit more history on what we're doing here. So Jenny, is it okay if I just turn it over to you and then we can dig in and do questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everybody. I haven't had the opportunity to come much to the home visiting group, and so excited to be joining you today, and definitely happy to answer any questions and or talk through any concerns that folks are having on what we're planning around the home visiting account. And as Julie said, I was actually former Senate Ways and Means staff from about 2008 to 2013. And so when I was looking at your history on your account, I was recalling some of the history that I had personally with this statute and work on the account. So have definitely been around and near this topic for quite some time. So. With that, I think we can go ahead and show some of the slides. Yeah, thank you. And we can go to the next slide. So mostly just I think covering things that everyone else here knows, and certainly invite my programmatic folks that are with us to join me because again I have some of the history and I have spent also time in as the Chief Financial Officer for DCYF, so have a history with the account and funding in general. But I'm sure there's going to be maybe details that I will miss, so feel free to jump in. But as folks recall, the home visiting services account was established originally in 2010 and then revised in 2013 and revised again in 2017. So I think that kind of just shows the nature of dedicated accounts in terms of sometimes we don't always get it right in terms of the statute and what we want the account to be able to do and function. Dedicated accounts, just more generally in state government, definitely exist. They tend to be a little bit more rare in the human services world. And we'll get into this a bit later, but this account really functions as what I kind of laymansly term it an empty bucket account, which is it does not have a revenue source that is associated with the account directly. And we'll talk about that, what that means a little bit more here shortly. It was modified in 2013 to integrate federal funding into the account, which is really the crux of what we'll be talking about today and is what we're potentially thinking about undoing. And then updated again in 2017 around some of the private funding expectations. And then we have added additional sort of state funding to this account and federal pass-through that happened later. And that was just done sort of within our policy and agreements between agencies. We can go to the next slide. So I was warning everybody that like this is my really silly way to describe how this account works, but I felt like sometimes a visual is helpful. And again, I also apologize. I know many of you maybe have all of this totally down, so but I felt like it was helpful for us to kind of go over this. But essentially, how the account functions today is it has a blend of funding in it. So it has state and federal. The interesting thing about federal is that federal doesn't really totally get deposited the same way for us. It's not like it's not like kind of what happens with the state general fund where that is officially deposited in the account. really what we're having in the home visiting account is authority from that account to spend that federal grant that we are actually getting from the federal governments. And so it's acting more like a pass through at that point. But all of that dumps into one account right now. And so you can see that that account has federal and state. The challenge, and if I would have had like, fancier graphics, access to I don't know, AI or something, but I don't. So, if I'd had a fancier graphic here, I would be able to show you that I think one of the challenges we continue to have in the account is that the size of that box overall is important for folks to understand, the legislature, us, you as contractors, because we obviously need to know how much money is sitting in the account. And there's two components to that. There's how much money is actually sitting in the account. And that's where things like underspend from previous deposits of state general fund or long haul federal grants can sort of sit in the account and have a temporarily larger number. And then there's also the authority to spend from the account. And those are two separate concepts, the way the legislature and like dedicated funds work. So when we have a dedicated fund, you have to sort of pay attention to both sides of the house. Do I have sufficient authority to spend? And do I have enough money in the bank, so to speak, right? And you have seen this over time that one of the challenges we've had is getting either number correct, right? That there's confusion about how much money actually sits in the account, and also there's confusion about how much authority should be made available, especially in these two different buckets, federal and state. And I think that both of those things have tripped us up on occasion where we've had money in the bank and we can't spend it because we don't have sufficient authority, and vice versa, that there's been an expectation of spend when there's potentially not those kinds of resources or the specific type of resource that can be spent in the account. And then obviously we're taking all that money and sending it out. I simplified this inside contracts. Obviously, it gets spent on on all the potential applicable uses for the account. But that was just to sort of simplify it. If we go to the next slide, what we're sort of proposing in this one, and obviously you could contemplate an option where the home visiting account goes away altogether. I think, we heard loud and clear in the department that that might be like a step too far for us at this moment in time for us to think about it. And there's definitely some benefits to having a dedicated account on the state general fund side. But what we're sort of talking about is really just pulling that federal out of the actual account and letting that federal sit inside of DCYF's overall federal authority. The department has significant federal authority, and again, that's that permission to spend. So we get a grant from the feds, but we also need the permission to spend it, and we can potentially be directed on how we spend those dollars. We have significant federal authority at the agency level. So the nice thing is that if there were, for example, increases or other types of federal funding that comes to the table that could be used for home visiting, we wouldn't necessarily have to go and ask for that additional federal authority if we pulled it out of the account, because we have so much that sits at the agency level, because we literally are doing hundreds of millions of dollars of activities with federal funds at any given time. And then the proposal would be to have that state general fund deposit happen into the home visiting services account. You'd keep your account, you'd have a dedicated amount, but you can see just maybe in this visual how it makes it much simpler to determine how much money is in the home visiting services account without that federal authority sort of sitting in there and having to pay attention to two different moving pieces inside of the dedicated account. So that's really kind of what we're talking about at a high level. I'm happy to either run through kind of the rest of our slides and talk through, or I don't know if it would be helpful most for folks to have an opportunity to ask questions at this moment, just thinking about looking at kind of these two visuals. All right, I'm going to keep plowing through and then we'll have some opportunity for conversation. Um, so just again, kind of this is just highlighting in bullet format some of the challenges that we're trying to address with this blending of funds. Um, it kind of also made more sense when the state dollars were such that they actually did stay in the account. So when you have that deposit of state funds happening into the account and we have money, we can take that money across fiscal years, which is a nice feature of having a dedicated account. When you have a direct general fund state appropriation, you get what you get each year, and whatever you don't spend, you turn back. The downside is that in a downward turn in the budget, like we are experiencing currently, the legislature has the authority to go in and hoover out with their little vacuum any excess funds that are projected to be in the account. And so again, that's why it becomes really important if you are going to have a dedicated account for your state general fund during times like this. It's really important for us to all have clarity about exactly how much money sits in the account, because if they take too much out, that can be a problem as well. But having a dedicated account does not protect or offer really any protection from the ability of the legislature to go in and remove funding that they do not think is going to be used in the current fiscal year or biennium. And how they typically do that is they'll pull the account language into the budget bill itself and amend it so that they can pull that state general fund out or use those funds in the home visiting account for some other purpose temporarily to solve the budget crisis. Again, I was legislative staff from 2008 to 2013. I can tell you this was a real favorite technique of legislative staff. Dedicated accounts are one of the first things that the legislature and legislative staff will be looking at to see if there is funding that they can pull from these dedicated accounts. Then we also have confusion that gets created by having the federal in there, because the federal fiscal years, as I think many of you know, and our drawdown periods, spending authorities, et cetera, are all mismatched, right? So the federal fiscal year is offset from the state fiscal year. And so that can create a lot of confusion. We also tend to be spending multiple years of a federal grant. That's just pretty typical for us to potentially have multiple federal years open at any given time. And so you can imagine when I'm trying to set that amount of authority, that amount that we can spend out of the account from the federal side, when I have that much complexity, different fiscal year, different open grant periods, it can be very hard to dial in the appropriate level of authority. And having that sit at the agency level would allow a lot more flexibility for this program. Additional federal accounting requirements apply to all the funds in the account. So the hard part is once we're dumping stuff in there, we could potentially up those requirements on sort of all the money, and gets more difficult to track. And then we're obviously under a tremendous amount of federal scrutiny in all grant areas. And so we may want to also, again, be able to have conversations with the feds that are not attached to this account, given the nature of where we are with this current administration. We can go to the next slide. So really, the proposed change to legislation, really simplistic, is just removing and striking the language in the account statute that says all federal funds received by the Department for Home Visiting Activities must be deposited into the account. That's it. So very simplistic RCW change here. We don't need to change a lot in order to have that federal. And then we don't really even have to do much other than, they'll have to change potentially our authority in the account to recognize the fact that the federal is no longer being deposited in there. But the agency has significant federal fund experience, and we have every other federal fund that we get does not go through a dedicated account. So it's actually more our practice in DCYF that we would have federal sitting outside of account. To my knowledge, when we built, and I actually did some of the changes adding the federal funds into this account, at the time, there really was the only other account that functioned like this with having state and federal was the disaster recovery account. And it is a very complicated account to administer. It's what we're experiencing right now with wildfires, right? You can put general fund state in, you also get your federal recovery funds. And part of the reason for doing it in that account example was because there is a very long haul associated with understanding the cost of disasters inside of Washington state. And so it made sense to have a dedicated account that you're sort of tracking over time. In this one, it kind of feels like at this point it's adding more complexity than it is worth.
So Jenny, I just wanted to pop in to just acknowledge, I think that the draft that folks saw before had some additional changes to the language in the account. We heard from folks that they felt like this is really confusing. we don't know what the impact of these are. And there was a desire to see like if it were just gonna separate federal funds from state funds, wanting it to be much more simple. And from a strategic standpoint, I think that does help us a little bit because if these folks are confused, lawmakers will be confused too. So, just wanting to have a cleaner path, but just wanted to acknowledge, I think that we had looked at some previous drafts that had some more like tightening up of the language, more clarity, kind of more conforming to the way that this probably should have been designed initially. So I just wanted to acknowledge it's a little bit different what folks are looking at today.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Julie. I'm like, we switched it up. We heard you. So, we have no desire to create our own headwinds on a bill that is supposed to be largely technical and clean up in nature. So, happy to go in with something that is more streamlined. We can go to the next slide. So just to be really clear about what this will and will not do, we are really hoping that this will alleviate confusion between DCYF and the legislature over spend and authority. It also removes some of the administrative burden of managing this account for DCYF, and this has been worked closely with our fiscal department as well to sort of say what would be easier for you. And that is, one of the things that we're responding to. And I think, again, also in a bad budget time, the need for clarity is even more important around how the account functions because we don't want a situation where there's like an inadvertent sweep of funds that goes above and beyond what the state side of the account can handle. It does not result in any changes to provider contracts. It does not change how the funds are spent. It's really should be all internal. You should not be feeling the difference in this change. It really is to help us be able to administrate the account. It will also help us answer your questions more effectively, right? Like how much money, let's supply a budget. We should be able to separate out that state and federal a little more clearly, and I think provide a lot more transparency into how these funds, how much funds we have, and how those funds are being used. Next slide. And that's it. So we are open for sort of questions, discussion. I will offer up first for Julie and or program folks, Nellie, Vicky, Cynthia, Laura, if any of you want to jump in and add anything that I may have sort of missed.
So when we had our last meeting, I think we did some breakup groups. I think there were a lot of kind of questions coming of that out of that. I'm just wondering, just getting a temperature check on like whether or not kind of having a little bit more information is helping provide the clarity maybe that we need. So I'm just wondering if anybody wants to speak to, or do you have outstanding questions? Are there additional things that you would want to learn about or know more about?
Erica? Erica's had the benefit of probably hearing this spiel from me like 20 times over the last 10 years or something, 15, 20 years. So
Well, thank you. And I just want to say thanks to everyone at DCYF working on this. And Jenny, I appreciated the walk down memory lane. When I met you, you were working on this portfolio. So, no, this and the background is super helpful. And as someone who works on the ground with the legislature, I very much agree with the simple is that, what is it? Kiss analogy, keep it simple. I think that's really wise going into this legislative session. And I think that this strategy of separating it, a very simple technical one sentence will make it easier to convey why. And I think this is a really, really great approach. And thanks to everyone. I appreciate it's not lost on me that there's a lot of folks here from DCYF. So thank you for taking the time to explain this to us. And I look forward to helping working alongside y'all to get this through the process.
Well, I always tell people when I'm doing a presentation that I have a limitedly speaking autistic child at home, so I can sit in silence like all day long. But I also want to be respectful of people's time. But no question too small for sure, or because I don't expect people to be experts in how these funds work. Julie, do you want to maybe just talk next steps in terms of how the agency will proceed? And feel free if there's continued questions
Sure. And
from the
like if
chat.
you have a question later in the week, if you're, pulling weeds in the garden over the weekend and you come up with an additional question, please feel free to reach out and I can put my email address and Jennifer JP's email address in the chat. We're happy to help try and track down answers or get more information for you. But our next steps are that we will be submitting this as agency request legislation in September to the governor's office. And just because the department submits something and says like, hey, governor's office, this is something that we want to pursue, doesn't mean that they're going to give us the thumbs up on that. So there's a much longer process, but we will not, maybe know until maybe November. Um, whether the governor's office has approved this agency request legislation to move forward. I think one of the things that I'm hopeful about this moving forward is because it costs $0, and we are in a very, very difficult environment with regard to that. And so it doesn't cost any money. There will be a decision package that goes with it, mainly to say like, we're going to move this fund to this fund. But there's no cost associated with the decision package. It's just really about where funds will move around. And then, we will hopefully have this approved by the governor's office. We've had some initial conversations with OFM and talked to them about what we want to do. The initial conversations we had, they said, yes, this makes a lot of sense. We think this would clarify some challenges. And, this is kind of more the direction that these kinds of accounts are moving is to trying to separate out the state and federal dollars. So their initial response was fairly positive about that. So, but more to come. Again, the governor's office hasn't approved, so we don't know whether this will be agency request legislation, and we probably won't know until November-ish or sometime before legislative session starts. I'm always surprised something happens the last minute. So if
This is
this,
Marilyn. I have a question. I I rarely use Zoom anymore. I'm like, how do I raise my hand in Zoom that get to feel silly again? Um, anyway, does this mean that going forward, like if we were, by some miraculous way to get more federal funds, they would go into the federal box, like automatically?
Yeah, so the way federal funds generally work for DCYF outside of this account is that we have increases and decreases that happen in our federal grants, and we are just managing that against our sort of generalized federal authority. We can certainly report by grant, that is not an issue. So, and report and track by grant, we have to. So, regardless of whether these go into a federal fund or not with McV, because it has a very tight federal authority associated with it and very specific rules on what it can be spent on. It can't go kind of to the ether, right? Which I think is probably a concern sometimes. But it really has to be managed and tracked, and we should be able to provide all of that in terms of saying, here's which grant years are open, here's how much the grants are, here's how long we can spend them. All of that transparency and tracking can still happen, even if it's not in the dedicated account. I don't know, Marilyn, if that answers your question, but okay.
any other questions or concerns or thoughts, observations? So just, by way of, and I'm sure that Erica could probably give you any thoughts. If this is a concept or an idea that you support and you're communicating with the governor's office, or it would be great to share that information with them. So that they're aware that this is something that has support from home visiting providers. Or if you have any, and again, if you have questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to us directly. But they had like once we submitted, the decision making lies with them as to whether or not it moves forward. Okay. All right. Thank you.
I have to
It
say,
sounds
it's a
like
really successful meeting when we have no questions and we get to finish early. Like, woo!
well, we either confused everybody or
Yes, yes.
but I saw some positive head nodding here as well that is feeling like it's more clear. So. Great. All right. Well, it sounds like we can end this meeting early and give folks a half hour back in your day. So,
Thanks so much for being here, everybody. It's good to see you.
Yeah. Thank you for joining at short notice. So we appreciate it. These things move fast, but we wanted to make sure that we're transparent and bringing you all along. And again, if you have thoughts, concerns, questions that come up after, don't hesitate to reach out. We're happy to answer those.